Now in Iran, at least 9 more people were killed overnight in clashes between protesters and security forces. This as deadly anti-government protests enter a 6th day. Well, violence on Monday night brings the total number of people killed in the unrest to more than 20. There's growing anger in the country over the rising cost of living and inflation. Police, meanwhile, have arrested more than 450 protesters in the capital, Tehran. Elsewhere in the country, demonstrators also attacked police stations, with reports of at least 2 security officers killed. Well, joining us on the France 24 debate today is Genevieve Abdo, a resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation. She's in Washington. We also have Fariba Hatch-Trudy. She's a writer and journalist. Shavin Malikzadeh is a visiting professor of political science at Williams College, also in Washington. And we have France 24's Sanam Chantier joining us as well. Welcome to you all. Now, earlier today, Iran's supreme leader accused the country's enemies of fueling unrest. President Rouhani, meanwhile, has called the demonstrations an opportunity but not a threat. US President Donald Trump has expressed his support for the protest. France 24's Anka Ula has this report.
منتظر یک فرصت منتظر یک رخنه است که از این رخنه وارد بشه.
After 5 straight days of violent protests, Iran's supreme leader has spoken for the first time.
Look at what's been happening in the past few days. All those who are against the Islamic Republic, those with money or in positions of power, those with weapons and intelligence, they're joining hands so they can spark chaos in the Islamic Republic.
The chaos he speaks of is growing. What started off as small protests against economic hardship has become deadly nationwide political dissent. The past 2 nights have been the deadliest. State television reported 9 deaths on Monday, after 10 more people were killed the night before. 6 protesters were killed outside a police station in the town of Kaderijan. The government says they attacked the station with weapons. State TV also reported a member of Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard was killed that same night in Najafabad, also in the same province. In Tehran alone, hundreds of people have been arrested, and the head of Tehran's Revolutionary Court warned they would face harsh punishment, including death. President Hassan Rouhani, for his part, acknowledged Iranians' anger, but blamed the United States for the government's shortcomings. U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday tweeted his support for the protesters, for acting against the, quote, brutal and corrupt Iranian regime.
Welcome to the France 24 debate. Let's start with Genevieve Abdo in Washington. I mean, what's going on in Iran currently? For you, is it an economic revolt or indeed is it politically motivated?
Well, it's important to understand that it began as an economic revolt. But if you see the chants, which are very important, the slogans, they have moved quickly to political commentary about the system. And for the first time, really, there's very harsh criticism against Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, the protests in 2009 and 2010, those protests also focused on Khamenei, but certainly not to this extent. People are shouting death to the dictator, and they're asking for him to be overthrown. So even though probably the underlying causes had to do with high unemployment, with high inflation, it's important to note that we are now talking about people's discontent with the political system, which of course is supreme clerical rule.
I mean, if we bring you in, Fariba Hatch-Trudy, you're a writer and a journalist. I mean, what do you make of this? As our guest just said there are growing calls, essentially, for, the dictator to be, to fall, or death or freedom is one of the chants that we've heard increasingly over the last 6 days. What do you make of that?
First of all, let me have a real sorrow and thought for the victims in Iran, my people. And as I told you, I'm living there now after 50 years, more than 50 years being in France. Certainly there is, people are fed up with their condition of life. Economically, first of all, they cannot, there is inflation, there is unemployment. The young people, educated people, they cannot get job. They are against this, the corrupted system which they see, and everything is known in Iran, who are stealing the the money of the country, the runaway, and people, they don't have jobs. But I should say that if in fact there is a fed up about the whole thing in Iran now, and we could see that, I used to say all the time that here in France or in Iran, when I see, people, or when I go to the different administration, that if they don't do anything about the national problems, that is the threat. The threat doesn't come only from outside. I don't say there is no threat from outside, but that is the real threat. But the problem is that Rouhani has tried, and he's trying still, to make that understand to the people that they don't want to let their prerogative and their interest, financial interest, economic interest, political interest.
You touch on
we
Rouhani
should
there.
say that another thing is that people, they are fed up, but they are very aware, in my opinion, my humble opinion. They are very aware about what's going on around them. They are very aware and thankful, on the entre guillemets, thankful for the security that they have in Iran. And they don't want, in my opinion, they are very conscious that what they want and what they don't want. Then, in fact, there is also slogan, political slogan. It's why Rouhani talked about liberty today and freedom.
You touched on Rouhani. We'll come back to Rouhani. Sanem, if I can just come to you for a second, because you spoke about people being generally fed up in Iran. I mean, give us some colour, if you will. What is everyday life like for people living in Iran, ultimately?
So this is something that was addressed by the two guests that just spoke, Rochelle. There's mass dissatisfaction across Iran because, of course, the more moderate-leaning administration of President Hassan Rouhani came along in 2013, and during that presidential campaign promised to improve the country's relationship with the international community, which was achieved through that historic nuclear deal, which was clinched in 2015, but also he promised to improve the economy. And it certainly has, in comparison to what we had with the previous administration. Inflation now stands at around 10% in comparison to what was on average 20%. But unemployment, Rochelle, has increased. It's gone up by 1.4% in comparison to the previous fiscal year. So something that has been circulating on social media from this older man who actually was part of the anti-monarchists, and he took to the streets to make the revolution in 79 happen, said, look, I have 3 children. They have doctorates, they're engineers, and none of them are working at the moment. And that's an immense problem. But add to this, I was in Iran last week, and even for myself, I could see that over a period of months, the prices of very basic food products, like, we're not talking about luxury products here, we're talking about rice, we're talking about meat and eggs, had increased by 20 to 30%. Additionally, Rochelle, the problem here, and this is what the average Iranian believes, is that expectations were not managed. Too many promises were made, and we have to keep in mind that Iran has been suffering under very draconian sanctions for decades. On top of that, we had the previous corrupt administration of Hassan Rouhani, and now the economy is in so much tatters that people's wages aren't being paid. So something like this is going to take not days, not weeks, not months, but years and years of recovery.
Okay, Shervin Malekzadeh, if I just bring you in this, Sanem's been painting a picture for us of everyday life in Iran. I know that in terms of the Green protest in 2009, you were there, you saw what was going on. You can clarify for us what your position was there. How are these protests different from what we saw in 2009?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of us have been really discussing and debating this because both the cohort that's here in the U.S. and friends and contacts we have in Iran find that this movement or this, Iran never fails to surprise. And what's happening on the ground seems to have very little connection to the participants and the observers of the Green movement, myself included, who was there, as you pointed out. I think the Green movement, at the time that we were there, as was mentioned earlier, the notion of death to the dictator or death to Khamenei, those sort of chants did emerge, but it took some time for that to happen. It was quite jarring. That they're happening much more rapidly now is impressive and can't be ignored, I think. But I would just caution that everyday life in Iran, in terms of inflation, in terms of failed expectations, in terms of frustrations, if you've traveled in Iran or if you've been in Iran for the last 10 or 15 years, you know that this is a common theme. And I think actually what's happening now in Iran is not, in addition to the sort of disbursement of the protests away from the capital to the provinces, is a sort of generational shift that's happening with the rising generation that might be known as the fifth generation. In other words, generations who were 90% of whom were in high school when the Green Movement happened. And during 2009, we were desperate to get those of us who were reporting on the ground were desperate to get the rest of the world to notice that this was not just a northern Tehran phenomenon, the Green Movement, that this was a broad-based phenomenon, albeit mostly centered in the capital. The provinces were seen as being exposed due to their lack of visibility to the foreign press or to the international community. That it's now dispersed to, just to finish the thought, that it's dispersed to these provinces, I think can be explained in many ways to the involvement or the incorporation of rural youth populations into both the educational system and the economic situation in Iran. I can elaborate more on that if you like.
Okay, we certainly will. Genevieve Abdu, if I just bring you in to respond to what our guest just said, I mean, this has been called a leaderless uprising, as it were, similar or very different to the 2009 movement where there were clear leaders. Is that a positive or negative thing as far as you see things?
Well, I guess it depends on what the objective is. If the objective is to alter the regime, if the objective is to fundamentally change something, then I think that these protests are even more important than the ones that happened in 2009, because let's not forget, a lot of the people demonstrating are Khamenei's base. These are his supporters. These are people who support the Revolutionary Guards that we are now hearing from that they don't like what they're doing in the Middle East. So they don't agree with Iran's expansionist policies in the Middle East. So this is the base now that is opposing the regime, not the educated elite that have been sort of marginalized at this point. Many of the leaders of the Green Movement actually live abroad now. Many of the younger people fled to Europe in 2009 and 2010. So because political space has been created for those Iranians who had less of a voice in the political developments of the country, this is a very important development because they are presumably the people who support the regime. And I just want to add one other thing that's also very important, and that is that, the other guests did mention that the economic crisis is an ongoing problem in Iran. So I think as we get farther into these demonstrations, we will see that there are other causes, obviously political causes, social causes. One of the causes is that Iranians are upset that the government is spending so much money, has spent billions of dollars in Iraq, in Syria, now in Yemen, supports Hezbollah. So what is interesting and important is that the society is finally connecting, making this important relationship between the economic crisis in the country and how the government spends its money, how it spends its funds. And
Genevieve,
I also
let's bring in Fariba Hajtrudi, because you raise an interesting point there. We have heard coming out of these protests, some Iranians saying, look, we don't want our government focusing or indeed spending their money on Yemen, on Syria, on Palestine. Think about us and the issues in the country.
That is absolutely true. But on the other side, the Iranians are very aware that everybody knows that if the Revolutionary Guard and Mr. Soleimani weren't there, Daesh could have come to Iran very, very easily. They know that. They are, in a way, happy about their security. But in fact, they say that's enough now. Now the security is there. Daesh is finished, kind of finished anyhow. Now you should look after us. That is enough now. Maybe till now we could understand in a way saying, okay, regionally Iran should be very careful about Daesh as well, because we shouldn't forget that Daesh and all the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a real serious issue. Okay, but now people, they say that's enough. And there is another point that we didn't talk about it, none of your guests. It's not just the money spent on military causes or the sector of military, minister of military or whatsoever. The amount of money, the budget that is allowed to the Jose, which is all the circle of clerical medrese or school or what, it's 10 times something more that the amount of budget which is for the environment, which is one of the most critical point of the actual situation in Iran. And I had a tweet 2 days ago from a professor of university who is a very, very outspoken language, and he said Rouhani should say to the people that he cannot do anything and he doesn't have the budget to look after whatsoever people they're asking for. That's another point, you know.
Okay, let's bring in Sanam there. Sorry to cut you, because again,
please.
An interesting point. We've heard that essentially that various analysts in Iran saying, look, if we don't continue funding our allies, that Daesh or Al Qaeda could end up on our doorstep. But there's also been another criticism about the budget released recently. People saying, look, a number of social programs have been cut, and religious funding has kind of taken over. Your thoughts on that, Sanam?
I think I absolutely agree with the fact that it's not just about Iran's regional involvement or quote-unquote interference in neighboring countries such as Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, but also because the way Iran's budget has been allocated to those very religious clerical institutions that you referred to. But again, Rochelle, this is nothing new. There has been discontent over issues like this for decades now. The question now is why at this moment? And this is my understanding of the situation. There are many different contradictory views coming out, but these protests started unusually so in the more religious, holy, conservative city of Mashhad, which is very much unlike what happened with the 2009 movement.
That began in Tehran.
Absolutely. And northern Tehran even, which is more wealthy, which is more educated. And they didn't expect it to be like so-called wildfires, to catch on so quickly and to spread so wildly. But why did it? Because there is this immense discontent. As our guest just mentioned, Iranians were hoping that post the Islamic State group, of course there are still pockets of them dotted around, but post their alleged departure from the two countries, which was declared by Iran's head of Revolutionary Guards Corps, Qasem Soleimani, that then the country would start focusing on its own people. And that's one of the chants that you do hear from those protesters. Focus on us, prioritize us.
And also, focus on us and prioritise us. We're going to take a very short break here on the debate. We will come back for more responses from our panel. You're watching the debate today, looking at the ongoing unrest in Iran. Please stay tuned.
RFI France 24 and Monte Carlo Doualia, the France Media Monde stations. You say it best.
Je regarde souvent France 24 parce que la mode m'intéresse beaucoup et j'aime aussi la culture, le cinéma de la France.
Grâce à RFI, j'arrive à être connectée au monde.
Je définirais RFI comme Radio France incontournable parce que RFI donne des informations qui sont incontournables.
Es una nueva alternativa, es una nueva forma de ver, digamos, el mundo con otros ojos, desde otra perspectiva.
أخبار مميزة ومفصلة.
Having another television station coming in and giving us their perspective on the news, on a worldwide news, is very educational, very helpful for us here in Ireland.
مواد إعلامية نشطة تمتاز بالحركة والمتابعة.
J'aime bien France 24 parce que c'est la juste combinaison entre l'apprentissage de la langue française et l'actualité internationale.
Je me rends heureux et content dans la vie de tous les jours.
Sur les observateurs, j'ai dénoncé ce qui ne va pas bien chez nous, comme la gestion des déchets.
RFI en 3 mots, ce serait qualité, régularité et intégrité.
R, relation. F, France. I, international.
RFI, please continue providing the truth. Never forget who you are.
وأنا نحب المعلومة الصحيحة ونحب المعلومة تكون شافية وضافية وتكون بلهجة تتماشى مع يفهمها كافة شريحة المجتمع.
وتم إثباتها من خلال برنامج مراقبة.
Your correspondent here in Ankara always tells the news exactly as it is.
I'm a big fan of France24.com. Your breaking news keep me updated 24/7.
Depuis 10 ans, je vous écoute quotidiennement. Ça m'a permis de me nourrir intellectuellement et émotivement.
Bonne année.
Happy New Year.
Feliz año
RFI, France 24, Monte Carlo, Douala, and the entire France Média Monde group wish you a Happy New Year.
Welcome back to France 24. Quick reminder of the top stories that we're following for you. South Korea offers high-level talks with rival North Korea for cooperation on next month's Winter Olympics. It comes a day after Pyongyang warned the US that its nuclear forces are now a reality. Iran's supreme leader accuses Tehran's enemies of stoking unrest as anti-government protests enter a sixth day and the death toll rises to more than 20. And Israel's parliament approves a bill making it harder to cede control over parts of Jerusalem in the event of a future peace deal with Palestinians. Palestinians have reacted angrily, as has the Israeli opposition. And rallies have been held in major cities in Pakistan following a controversial tweet from Donald Trump. This after the president accused Islamabad of offering lies and deceit in return for $33 billion in funding. All right, welcome back to the France 24 debate. We've been talking about Iran, where at least 9 more people were killed overnight. This in clashes between protesters and security forces. Now, anti-government protests have entered a 6th day. The violence bringing the total number of people killed to more than 20. Well, the President Hassan Rouhani has reacted. Let's have a listen.
The problem is not only an economic one. It's not like people have come to the streets to say, we want money, bread and water. They have other demands as well, like allowing for a freer environment.
All right, staying with us on the debate, we have Shervin Malekzadeh, a visiting professor in Washington. Just a comment on that. Comments from Hassan Rouhani 2 days ago. He's been accused of playing this all down. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, my response would be that rather than look at this situation or Rouhani's response as one of panic or of trying to appease an electorate that is displeased, I would rather that we talk about the situation in Iran and the protests as happening as not being a categorical one. That the Iranians are in the streets not necessarily because they're seeking overthrow of this state, but rather holding their elected officials accountable. This possibility, while I don't disagree with my fellow panelists that there is incredible outrage and displeasure with what the regime is doing, the idea or the notion might be from below an expression of wanting politicians, including Rouhani, to do their job. And this would be very difficult to do if their heads are chopped off figuratively, right, off with their heads. I think the notion that the politics in Iran right now are a pursuit of overthrow of the state would ignores the fact that there's been, at least since 2009, a sort of extension of a type of politics or participation from below where the population is doubling down on the state's own rhetoric and promises and policies. And so this necessarily involves a type of engagement, whether it's at the ballot box or having failed there out in the streets. So this is the sort of nuance I might introduce to this conversation. I don't disagree that there is many segments of Iranians who will tell you privately, and now as we see publicly, that they want this regime overthrown. But we must balance that out, I think, with perhaps a larger population that's willing to allow this system to continue because this is their best bet for incrementally improving their lives. And I think characterizing the 2009 protests as being a phenomenon of northern Tehran or of the poor who are protesting now of being, quote-unquote, Khamenei's base is a bit misleading given the fact that Rouhani won with such a substantial majority both in 2013 and especially in this last election in 2017.
I mean, let's have a think about, the government has kind of blamed hardliners or said, they're not responsible for what's going on currently. The US, we've heard criticism of foreign agents or foreign enemies, if you will. I mean, what do you make about that? Do we need to see a different approach to these protests?
This is for me, the question?
No, I was asking Fariba Hatch-Trudy. We can come back to you, though.
Oh, sorry.
I think I agree that people want now to live decent life, and nothing works properly in Iran. Nothing. When you live there, you see that everywhere they should be reform. Recently, again, a professor of university said, for 40 years, you were running the university. Now let it for 3 months. Let professor of university and dean of university run the universities. Just for one example. That can go in any sector of the, and when you think about the judiciary, that is okay. Then, in fact, there is a crisis of people doesn't have any more confidence on promises. And one example I can give, it's after the earthquake, private people could have more money, asking the money from, than the the crossroad of the governmental network to helping the victim of the earthquake. It's just to say that people want, in fact, not just the reform, but no more corruption. How do you say assainissement in English? I don't know how you say to. I told you I'm very tired these days because I can't sleep about what's going on in Iran. But they want to have a right person at the right place, let's say. Then the administration should work better. The university should work. There is, when you live in Iran, sometimes you wonder how still it could, everything works still, because nothing. It's at the right place. It's the problem of corruption, the problem of leadership. If they make the difference, yes, people make the difference. For instance, if Rouhani could have the government that he wanted, he couldn't. He had promised that we want to have. I want to have at least half, women in charge of. He couldn't have just one woman minister in post.
Let's get some reaction to that, because you spoke about confidence being at an all-time low when it comes to the government. Genevieve Abdo, if I bring you in on this, I would imagine that confidence also went down, as it were, after the 2015 nuclear accord. Some Iranians feeling that essentially the benefits haven't quite trickled down to them.
Well, I think that the role that the nuclear deal, its success or failure, is being exaggerated, actually, as having a role in these protests. I think that the other causes that we've identified throughout this conversation are far more important. And here in Washington, just to give you an example, there's a lot of focus and debate. There's a very ideological and polarized debate about what former President Obama did, that the nuclear deal wasn't a good idea, that the nuclear deal is a good idea. And I don't think really that that's what the protests are about. I'm sure if you talk to ordinary Iranians, and even the Iranians I know living outside the country who were part of the Green Movement, people don't even know what the details of the Iran nuclear deal were. And I think that more importantly, if you look at this factually, even if you look at Iran's spending, its foreign investments pale by comparison to the money it spends in its military expansionism in the Middle East. So even if the nuclear deal were in full force today, that wouldn't be a primary source of Iran's revenues. So I think that, there's a tendency, particularly in Washington, to focus on the nuclear deal as being part of the grievances that are being expressed now, but I think that's a real misnomer. And I just want to correct something else that was said in the conversation, and that's about Daesh. I seriously doubt that, again, that the protesters are sort of reacting to the fact that now that ISIS or Daesh has been defeated in some parts of the Middle East, that they expect change. I mean, Daesh was never really a threat to Iran inside Iran. The movement exists to some degree within Sunni populations, and that they go into countries where they think they have popular support. Going to a predominantly hugely Shia country was never really part of their agenda. So I think, again,
do you want to respond to that?
Daesh
I would like to respond to that. I would like to wholly
No.
disagree with the assessment
Absolutely.
of our colleague in the Arabia Foundation there, who claims to understand
Absolutely.
the mindset of Iranians. We go in and out of Iran every few months. We're very much aware that actually, you know what, they may have not read those 100 pages of the JCPOA, which is the nuclear deal. However, they did expect something out of it. They did expect foreign companies to pour into the country and to provide employment. So that's what, when I went straight after the nuclear deal was clinched in 2015, all I could hear on the streets was, Inshallah, we have hope. God willing, we have hope that something will happen. And guess what? Only several months ago, we heard from one of the biggest companies that had signed a deal with the Iranians, France's own Total, saying, actually, we are more cautious now because we're hearing warnings from the US administration. And frankly, if we had to pick between Tehran and Washington, hey, we're going to have to go with Washington. So that theory is wholly inaccurate.
No, I mean, Washington has weighed in on this with a tweet, of course, from Donald Trump supporting these protests. Let's just show you that tweet if we can, because obviously the US having some effect, essentially, in terms of sanctions and how far Iran can move forward. And if we can bring you up that tweet. Iran is failing at every level, despite the terrible deal made with them by the Obama administration. The great Iranian people have been repressed for many years. I mean, let's talk about repression. That question to the panel. Have things changed now that President Rouhani is in power? Are things better? Are they worse? That question to the panel.
To who?
To the panel. Okay. You can respond,
Right.
Heriba.
Yeah, definitely. I can say definitely that of course there's repression in Iran. There's no doubt about it. But again, I don't want to compare all the countries around, including Saudi Arabia. There's no repression, there is. In Iran, what has changed since Rouhani came to power, and he said in his discourse today that people, they don't want just bread and water, they want to open the country, and they want, in fact, more freedom. And you see that when you see the civil society, how everything works when the civil society, the NGOs, they work better than any administration in Iran. Then they know, Rouhani knows what's going on in Iran and what is the potentiality of this people. Now, since he came to power, in fact, the repression is target, very much target, and whatsoever the Ministry of Information, or let's say the Revolution Guard especially, wants to do, if they think that it goes against the interest of the country, or they will not hesitate. But for the ordinary life, what's going on in the street, there is no more the militia. You don't see them. Wherever you go in the country, you feel, as a woman, I can go wherever I want. I cannot feel any kind of repression under my head. While I was in Iran under Ahmadinejad, that all the civil secret services, they were everywhere.
Figures do show that human rights has sadly deteriorated under the administration of Hassan Rouhani, because the judiciary is in the hands of Iran's so-called conservatives, ultra-conservatives or hardliners, and they from the outset said that this is not your jurisdiction. Should we decide to arrest journalists or activists, that is not something that Rouhani can interfere in. And even from the beginning during his presidential campaign, he's tried to at least vocally call for the release of Iran's leaders of the opposition movement, the likes of Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karabi, and the judicial forces have come out and said, that's not your place to tell us to do so.
So Shervin, let's bring you in then. Let's bring Shervin in then, Malik
sentence.
Zadeh. Very quickly, and I'll bring in Shervin Malik.
Just one sentence. And also, because the population doesn't accept anymore, the protest is that, to say we are not afraid anymore.
Okay.
And that is definitely a word to the judiciary and to the hardliner.
Shervin Malik Zadeh, is Rouhani's or are Rouhani's hands tied, given the fact he doesn't control all of the country's economy? He certainly doesn't have, as Sanam was saying, much say over the religious institutions. Are his hands tied?
Of course he is. I mean, the Iranian political scene, as we all know, is very fragmented, and he does not have access or power or leverage over the sort of agencies that would arrest, as many of us have as a friend, Jason Rezaian, or other academics, for example, who are in Iran, or the sort of oppressions and torture that we know that continues on in that country. But I agree with the earlier guest who made the comment. Again, I've been traveling there for about 10 years pretty consistently, that the atmosphere presently in Iran is night and day compared to what it was under the time of Ahmadinejad. I would like to come back very quickly, if I may, to this to the tweet you put up in the comments, the sort of crocodile tears that we're seeing being shed by many, let's say, less than promising politicians here in D.C. at least, the same sort of politicians who would deny grandmothers or asylum seekers entry into Iran. I think this conversation, and this is a good way maybe to link it back to the discussion about Syria and Daesh and Iraq. Many Iranians, at least to me, in my reporting and my research over the last several years, starting from 2009, are also quite aware of what would happen if a state collapsed or a state failed or this regime were overthrown. I think this is a very important point that we have not discussed yet.
Absolutely.
The example of Syria and Iraq especially looms largely, and over and over and over again. I really can't overstate this. Iranians told me, and of course this is mostly anecdotal, but I think it holds up with election results and the support for Rouhani, we do not want to become Syria. Absolutely. We cannot become Syria.
Absolutely.
What does that mean? That means either a collapse from within, as many are now celebrating. Again, many of these tweeters I referenced earlier. It's as if we have limits on our imagination as to what's possible in Iran, or the capacity of ordinary Iranians who are absolutely upset to have agency or a capacity to have inner lives. Iranians realize that they have to solve their own problems from within. And I would suggest, just to reiterate a point I made earlier, that these protests are an expression of that. Yes, many people are saying death to Khamenei, death to the supreme leader, but there are also many, many people, I promise you, who would rather have this system remain, as much as they may despise Khamenei or the whole apparatus, the nizam as it were.
If I could please interrupt, I think that you have to look at this historic. If you have to look at this historically, I don't think that anyone is saying that the regime is going to collapse tomorrow. But if you look at the 3 stages of protest beginning in 1999, and I was actually a correspondent with The Guardian at that time, the needle is moving. So in 99, there was no discussion whatsoever of questioning the supreme leader. In 2009 and 2010, there was great movement on that topic. And now we're at even a different place than we were in 2009 and 2010, where the society is becoming bold. Please don't interrupt me. And so I think that you have to look historically at the 3 phases of protest. No one is saying the regime is going to collapse tomorrow, but to not acknowledge that red lines are being crossed now is not to understand what's happening. And I think, again, if you look at it historically, what has happened since 1999, we're at a completely different place for a lot of reasons, because of the development of technology, because the world is a different place now, because in 2010 even, or 2009, only 30% of Iranians, according to Harvard University, even had access to the internet. So we're at a different place now, and I think that if you look at the trajectory of Iranian politics
in 2009,
Shervin, do you want to come in? We are running out of time. Do you want to come in very quickly before we come back to our panel?
Yeah, I think that's a sort of straw man argument. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's mischaracterized or said that nobody's saying death to the supreme leader or death to the system. But to this last point, which is very telling, and I was in Iran in 2009. Very few people had smartphones. Almost nobody engaged with Twitter. We had a much broader, not in geographic sense, but in terms of numbers, and much more sustained protest than we're seeing now. And that you know, this idea that somehow having technology or having this quote-unquote awareness ignores the possibility that Iranians are engaging with their system in more intense ways. Because the red lines have been moved, the system is actually being forced to become more responsive. And this fixation on let's get rid of the supreme leader or not, I'm only suggesting clouds our analysis in the broader context in which politics is occurring in Iran.
I promise you the protests will end when people are killed and there's more repression. That's how, unfortunately, these protests will end.
That's possible.
Let's come back to the studio because you did talk about social media there. Just talk us through what's been going on social media-wise.
Rochelle, the use of social media as a tool to disseminate information and images actually started not with the Arab Springs, as some experts have been saying, in 2011, but it started in 2009 in the aftermath of those disputed presidential elections. A lot of journalists, like myself, we were no longer permitted to go on the streets and cover the events, so we started turning to social media on Facebook and partially, not so much as it is today, to Twitter. And at the time, what the government did was A, slow down or disconnect internet fully, or B, block these particular sources. And so Iranians, being as smart as they are technologically speaking, used proxy servers and VPNs to overcome these restrictions, and history is very much repeating itself. So particular apps like Instagram and Telegram specifically have been blocked. The reason for that is because Telegram specifically has been very pivotal in these rounds of protests, because people are at the moment using them, calling on others to mobilize across the country. Some of them are calling on Iranians to use Molotov cocktails against the government forces. So this has become extremely pivotal. But I find that even though the flow of information has slowed somewhat, people are finding different ways. They're using different sources. And this is how we get information out of a country at a time when there are restrictions imposed.
Perfect time for social media. Our social media specialist, James Creedon, is here. Welcome, James. All right, I'd just like to thank our guests on the debate. We had Genevieve Abdo, a resident scholar at the Arabian Foundation, who joined us from Washington. Fariba Hajtrudi, a writer and journalist. Thank you very much for your time. Shervin Malikzadeh joined us from Washington equally. And we had France 24 Sanam Shante with us here on the set. Thank you very much for your time on the debate today. All right, James, enough from me. We're looking at analysis in the Iranian press. What have you found?
Well, I suppose it's quite split, and Sanam will, of course, echo that between the reform-orientated press and the conservative press. So, Courrier International, which is a French magazine that translates foreign press, has been very helpful today for me. And we'll take a look at, first of all, Our Man. Now, they say that these demonstrations are an opportunity. If I could get the actual page up, it would be helpful. But they've been saying that the protests could be seen as an opportunity and not a threat, and that was a quote, in fact, from President Rouhani. Elsewhere, you have Etemad, thank you. And they're echoing a lot of worries from analysts or journalists, part of the educated middle class, as they put it. And a lot of these, I suppose, the more educated middle classes would have demonstrated in the protests of 2009, and they find today's protests disturbing because of a lack of leadership and a fear that there's no clear unified message. So its headline here calls for dialogue, calm and a good management, so echoing kind of those concerns. There's also an article by journalist Samina Rastegar, I think it's pronounced, and she says, it's difficult to get a clear picture of things when you don't speak the language. But as I said, I think the Courrier International has done a good job of summing it all up. And they quote here from that newspaper, there's an obvious principle here. If you prevent someone from talking, he will shout. If you deprive someone of hope for his future, he will finish up barely even caring about what can happen to him. In other words, despair breeds a lot of recklessness and an appeal for the government to listen and to demonstrate understanding. So that seems to be coming through a lot in the reform press. Meanwhile, the conservative press, unanimous condemnation, according to Courrier International's sum up of foreign agents, enemies of the people, appeals for a fierce crackdown. This is Kaihan, and a quote here is, riots, murders and vandalism, they're crimes, this is not civil contestation. In other words, let's treat it all as criminal acts and a severe crackdown. Meanwhile, Javan
Online.
That's right. They have a lineup here. I'm not sure if it's visible, of various US politicians, of course, including the US president, who have given their support to the protesters. And they're saying the hopes of the American and Saudi authorities for weakening Iran, their hopes of weakening Iran are unrealistic.
All right, well, we started talking about it here in the studio. Social media being restricted in Iran. What have you found? All right, well, I suppose
essentially Telegram and Instagram appeared since 2009 to be the foremost social media, because Facebook and Twitter are blocked. 20 million users for Instagram, 40 million users for Telegram, which is quite encrypted. So that is quite extraordinary. And you could see that Pavel Durov, the Dubai-based CEO, he was trying to negotiate quite a tricky interaction with the state. You had the telecommunications minister here tweeting him directly, saying a Telegram channel is encouraging hateful conduct, use of Molotov cocktails, etc., etc. Now, they did actually shut down one particular media, but then they didn't shut down another media linked to the original. So as a result, it just got taken down fully. So we'll see where that goes. But certainly very strict measures. Interesting to take a step back, because we all remember that this happened in Turkey, very notably, in recent times. But actually, I was surprised to read that between July 2015 and June 2016, there were 81 government-ordered disruptions to the internet across the globe. So this is actually something that maybe doesn't always get big media attention, but it's happening all the time. There was even an incident recently in India. So it is happening quite a bit. And this article on the Brown Political Review is reminding readers that internet access is not a luxury, it's a human right. And actually, last summer, it was inscribed into Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the promotion, protection and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. So it's being flouted the whole time, but it is, in fact, a right.
All right, James Creedon, our Media Watch specialist. That's where we leave it. Stay tuned to France 24. We'll have more international headlines coming up after a very short break for you.